All right, it's 7 o'clock, so let's get this thing started. So, everybody, the man, the myth, the legend, Stephen Mortdog Mortimer is here as our guest speaker. So, if you would like to take it away, Mort.
Yeah, my name is Mort. I have been a game designer for almost 20 years now, which is wild. One gray hair in my beard for each year, apparently. I worked at Nintendo for the first 11 years of my career, shipped a bunch of Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, a crosswords game, and a game no one's ever heard of called Aura Aura Climber. After that, they were like, we want you to make more Mario vs. Donkey Kong. And I was like, well, I'd like to try something different. So I went to Riot, where I worked on League of Legends and then TFT. Been doing that for a long time. And then the other fun fact about me is I've been streaming for 5 years, mostly TFT, the game I work on. Have built quite an audience with that. So, yeah, I've been doing this quite a while, have a bit of a unique approach to game design, but happy to be here and happy to answer lots of questions.
Awesome. All right, well, I guess we can start with a question. If someone has something they're eager to ask, maybe in the audience first or in the chat. Yeah.
We just
okay. So what we'll do is we'll read out any questions you guys type in the chat. We'll start from the top and we'll work our way down. Can you check the Meet for the Q&A? If anything pops in there. If you're online, if you want to send in a question, there should be a Q&A prompt in like the bottom right. I want to say I don't know exactly where it would be, but send your questions in there and then we'll get through them as well. But starting off here, we've got a question coming from Anson. Anson. All right. How do you balance between what the players want and what the developer believes would actually work out on a game?
Gotcha. So generally, the big thing to keep in mind is what is the primary goal of the game itself, right? Like, what are you trying to capture? What are you trying to do? And in a way, that goal should be targeted around what the player wants, but the player might not be able to convey what they want, right? Like, using TFT as an example, some players will be like, I want the most balanced game ever. Well, what that might mean to them is they want it to be sort of static and boring. And you're like, well, okay, look, I know you don't want that, but our goal for TFT is like, look, we want players to have a lot of fun, be replayable. And those goals that you set sort of become your North Star, right? Like everything about those goals, that's the thing you want to do. And really make sure that those goals are still player oriented, but not necessarily literally exactly what the players are asking for.
Cool. Awesome. We have another question in here. How do you deal with hate from your players? Is there like a tactic you have, or is there kind of just like a blanket, you just have to get over it?
So the honest answer is it's hard at first, especially when you're dealing with this, because when you start out as a game dev, like at Nintendo, players didn't know who I was, right? You're just a behind-the-scenes developer. And honestly, 99% of developers are behind-the-scenes developer. If you choose to have a public face, though, that hatred can come out in a lot of different ways. You know, I'm sure there was at least one person out there who was like, Mario versus Donkey Kong has the worst pink block mechanics in the world, and they were super angry about that. Like, okay, cool. And like I said, at first, especially if you're invested in your work, it can be pretty hard, right? Because like you're really invested and then someone's like, yeah, but you suck, you know, and you're like, okay, that feels pretty bad. But over time, what I can tell you is that what you learn is that human beings are really complicated. And I know that's a pretty broad statement, but there are people who are happy in their lives. There are people who are in a really bad spot. And so a lot of their frustration might not even be actually about you. It might just be they're frustrated at things. And so when you start to realize that it's less about you and more about like people just want to be angry in this world, unfortunately, you can kind of move past it and sort of, you know, learn to cope with it. Like I said, there's no miracle answer, though. There's nothing that's like when someone messages you and says, I'm going to kill your wife and kids, that makes that feel great. But you start to realize, like, look, it is what it is. And you just kind of, as long as you're doing the right thing by players and moving forward, that's all you can do. And so you try not to worry about things you can't control.
Thank you very much. We have another question in here. How do you balance abilities in a way that feels fair but impactful across different characters or roles?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because the concept of balance, right? Like balance is a word that gets thrown around but can mean a lot of different things, right? Is it balanced that paper beats rock instantaneously in a one-hit kill? I mean, not really, but like it's inherently balanced within the context of the game, right? And so what balance actually means is looking at the grand picture of the game, is it fair relative to everything else? And so if you're like a fighting game character who has very good anti-air versus a character who does not have or is in the air a lot, right? Those aren't an inherently balanced matchup, but the game itself might still be balanced. And so the thing you're trying to do is create lots of sharp outputs. Sakurai has a really good video about this where it's like, if you try to balance everything, everything will feel the same. Instead, you want sort of sharp identities, and those sharp identities should be balanced within the rest of the system. And so generally, TLDR here is make something that's really fun and unique, and then make sure it's fair in context of everything, not just specific little matchups.
Cool. What motivates you the most when it comes to designing a game? What has been kind of like the greatest impact on your decision making and kind of like ideology almost?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one because the answer is going to be a little generic, right? Like generally when you're trying to make a game, you said what motivates me the most. Well, what motivates me the most is making sure the game is fun, making sure people are having a good time. And like that sounds really generic and obvious, right? Like duh, just make the game fun. Who would have thought? But for me, the reality is if you are focused on making other people happy with your game, it's a pretty complicated problem, right? Like there are millions of players and each player is going to have a different unique taste. So in actuality, the complication is what is fun for the majority of players or our specific audience of players, right? One of the common mistakes people make when they start building their own game is like, I'm going to make it fun for me. But the reality is you're sitting there playing the game every day, multiple hours a day, testing it, whatever. You're actually a pretty bad judge of what is fun. Your players are what's fun. And so the thing that motivates me is like understanding how people are going to interact with the game and be excited by it and seeing if I can almost solve that puzzle of like, can I figure out what is going to really make them smile? That's a really exciting puzzle. So.
Awesome. We have a question from the online audience. They're saying it's going to probably be different today than it was 20 years ago when you entered the industry. But how would you suggest that somebody gets their foot in the door with such like fierce competition that's currently rife throughout?
Yep. So I want to preface this with it's a little like it's easy for me to say, right? I got to start at Nintendo and then go to Riot. It wasn't really hard mode per se. But what I will say is one thing that hasn't changed in the industry, especially in like North America, is that experience matters more than anything else. And so my recommendation is if you can get a job on like the smallest mobile studio on like the silliest game and get like 1 or 2 years experience, that is the most important thing. And then from there, leverage that experience combined with like your knowledge of games to get at a company that you might be more sought after. We recently hired somebody who's a designer on my team now, and like the first thing he worked on was mobile slot machines. And he tells me how much he hated it, and it's like, but he did get to learn about like what it takes to be on a team and what it takes to build that, right? And like there were a lot of skills that were valuable just from that 1 or 2 years working on it, even though it's like, who wants to work on mobile slot machines? Like no one, right? And so that first year or two, get that experience wherever you can, and a lot of like, especially like I said, smaller mobile companies, there's surprisingly a lot of decent openings if you're willing to get your hands dirty on that kind of stuff.
That's that's what I've heard from a couple other places, that if you kind of just get in somewhere and you can kind of leverage that. So thanks so much. We have a question here about sort of like leading a team. How do you manage a team with a lot of different skill sets? This person feels like their team, often they're, having to work with people that maybe they don't fully understand their workflow, or sometimes, that person is a little bit slower than them. Do you have any advice on how to kind of manage that?
Yeah. So there's a couple things when being a team lead to think about. The first is a sort of general philosophy I have is I would never ask somebody to do something that I wouldn't do myself. Oftentimes, one of the ways I build trust with my teammates is if there's grunt work or something that's like really easy and tedious, I'm like, let me help, no problem. I'm happy to take that off your plate. Because it, even though you're the lead or something like that, you're not above everyone else. We're all people. And so having that can really build trust within the team. The other thing to note is that being a leader on a team does not mean you're the one coming up with all the brilliant ideas. It does not mean you're the one who's like the genius or has the vision for the game. The best leaders actually are the ones who can recognize the best ideas. And so, for example, one of my superpowers is like we get in a room with 6 designers and 2 people say an idea and I'm like, wait, that one right there, what you just said, that is amazing. That is really good for our game. We should take that. And that's what kind of being a leader is about. It's not about me going, well, here's the way I would do it, And so understanding, where the ideas are coming from. And then the last thing I'll touch on is that being a leader of a team, whether it be a team of 4 or a team of 10 or whatever, everyone's going to have different strengths and weaknesses, right? So like, for example, my strength is in mechanics, but my weakness is in thematics, right? And so understanding everyone's strengths and weaknesses, you can leverage, hey, you know what? We have a mechanics question. Let's go to Mort. Hey, we have a thematics question. Let's go to Giovanni and like really understand which source you should trust to get the answers you need for any particular problem on a project. And again, if everyone's being treated as equals, then that's totally fine, right? And so everyone's coming together to solve that problem that may need it to be solved.
This isn't a question necessarily here, but it was something that came up when you're talking about that. You hear about a lot of studios that have almost like a very hierarchical structure where it's like the leader is not in the office ever, or they're like 7 floors above. Does Riot use a similar system, or is it sort of like almost like an open office type thing?
Yeah, so the reality, so Riot's culture is a little bit different than, say, Nintendo. They're actually almost the opposite of each other. Nintendo is very much the like traditional Japanese company where like once a month we would show our game to some higher up from Nintendo Japan. And if they said, hey, we want A, you went, yes, sir. You deliver them A. But whereas Riot is actually like, hey, this team, we want you to solve this problem. We don't care how you do it. See you in a month, right? Like they throw things sort of downward. The reality is every company's culture is going to be different. And sort of what you described where like the leader who's 7 floors up, there are bad leaders out there, right? Like it's just something you're going to run into. If you find yourself in that situation, it's really a good time to like maybe try to get out of that situation. I personally wouldn't want to work for a company like that, but there are things to learn, right? I had, for example, my very first boss was a little bit like that. This is the way I want it. But what I'll also tell you is that like interacting with them, I learned communication styles where it's like, okay, like a common one we use is we call it the menu. It's like rather than going to your boss and going, hey, here's my idea, and they shoot it down, you would go to your boss and go, hey, here are 4 ideas. Which one do you think is going to be really good? And then they go, well, that really obvious one that looks way better than the other 3. And you're like, great, did it. And you sort of learn that human communication tactic. So the other thing I guess I'll just add is look on the bright side of any bad situation as well, and always try to keep yourself growing and getting better. So.
Awesome, yeah. We have a question. If Nintendo was sort of the beginning of your design career, how did you get in? Was there like a silver bullet? Did you know somebody? Did you have an amazing portfolio?
Yeah. So okay, because a common thing you'll hear in the industry is like it's all about networking, right? It's all about who you know. And I can't deny that that's a thing that's out there. For me, though, I don't know anybody. I grew up in a small town in Washington. I didn't know anybody. But what happened was I was going to the school DigiPen, which is in Seattle. Their campus was literally right next door to Nintendo Software Technology. And about once per project, that company would ask for 1 intern. And I was in my sophomore year, and they were looking for juniors and seniors only. And I'm like, no. You got to let me apply. Like, Nintendo's my dream company. I know I'm a sophomore, but please let me apply. And they were like, you can try, but you're not going to get it. Well, I applied. They were happy enough. The final interview was they put 7 of us in a room with the Mario versus Donkey Kong 1 level editor that they had. and they asked us to make 3 levels. And so we had a level design test basically, and that went pretty well. But the other thing that actually happened in that interview was my computer broke down. And so I couldn't work on it for like 12 hours. And when that happened, I actually had a really calm, I'm like, cool, I understand. Like, we'll fix it when we can. I wasn't like freaking out about it. And that calm, cool, collected head actually kind of impressed my boss, combined with the level design test, that I ended up getting the job. But it was just weird that like, that's what kind of made me stand out compared to the other people in the interview. So.
Yeah. Do you, at Riot, is it common to use like design tests in that interview process? Is it kind of a take home? Do you do it like in the actual interviews? Like, here's a whiteboard, draw us a level or something? Obviously, I mean, with
yeah.
TFT,
Yeah, so I'll give you 2 examples. When I first applied to Riot, one of the level design questions they gave me was like based around Hearthstone. And it was like, hey, we want you to take this card. I think it was the Beast, which is like a very old card in the set. And they're like, what's good about it? What's bad about it? And what would you change? Like, change it to make it powerful, change it to make it viable and fair. So they're asking you to like iterate on a known game. And that's the kind of test you might get on a take home. And then in an interview, it might be like, hey, let's work together to, I'll use TFT terms, let's come up with a 1 cost for Boba Fett. What would that look like? Let's work together and brainstorm, right? And it helps you understand like your approach to work or how creative you can be, or do you understand what a 1 cost in TFT is, right? If you're saying your 1 cost Boba Fett should summon the frickin' Slave 1 and it blows up the whole board, you're like, you don't really understand what a 1 cost is, but you're very creative, right? And so it's like you start to understand that person's strengths and weaknesses. And so often those questions are mostly designed to like pick your brain a little and have fun with it. So.
All right, we have another question here. Do you have any advice for somebody who's working or wanting to work specifically in like game balance? Is that something that like is common? Is it what would you say to someone who's like, I want to work on balancing games?
Yeah, so hilariously enough, someone had an anecdote recently that I thought said this really well. A game designer is somebody who knows how to make games. A systems designer is a game designer who knows math. And that's really what it is, because like a good systems designer kind of understands the interaction between the various systems, which is often very mathematics based. So if you really want to be like a balanced designer on, say, like a League or a Apex or Call of Duty or whatever, definitely brush up on your spreadsheets and math skills. If you don't enjoy using spreadsheets and math, you're not going to enjoy being a balanced designer, because a lot of it is really just getting down to the nitty gritty and being like, hey, if I need to do a 4% buff on this thing and it hits this other part, what is that going to do? And here's how I'm going to prove my theory. And then here's how I'm going to take the win rates. And here's how I'm going to, like, it is so much spreadsheet and mathematics. So I really think it's, like I said, it's brush up on that. A common thing you'll see in the hobby space is, you ever see like in an MMO where they make those like DPS spreadsheets based on your gear, right? If you're this kind of person who likes to make those spreadsheets that calculate your DPS, congrats, you're probably on your way to being a systems designer or a balance designer or things like that. But if you're like, hey, I just like to make things neat and cool, you're probably not in that space. So, yeah.
All right. We have another question here. What do you do when sort of a large player base really wants a specific change, but you or your design team really feels that it would be harmful, maybe not right now, but in the future of that game? Is there kind of like do you secede a little bit? Do you kind of try and work around it? What does that look like?
It's an interesting hypothetical, because really, if a large group of players are asking for a thing, right? If it's a large enough group, because there's a difference between like a loud group on Reddit that's actually a minority versus like, no, this is like 30% of people really want this thing, right? If it's actually a large group of players that want your thing and you're thinking no, you might want to double check yourself, right? Because if that many players, it's like your approach might be, what am I not seeing? Why am I not seeing what the player pain here is? One of the most important things as a game designer is to have good empathy with what your players are experiencing. It's one of the reasons why I like streaming the game, so that when I experience frustrating moments, players are like, see, Mort gets it. Mort knows that that's stupid and bullshit, like, don't do that. But so if it's a really large group, I think the actual thing is you need to figure out why you think it's bad, and if it actually is bad, you better have a damn good justification. Now, if it's a small group, then that's where you have to like kind of hold your ground and be like, look, I understand. And so here are our goals. Like, we go back to those goals, right? That North Star. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish with the game right now. And I understand that you want this change, but it goes against this goal. And so we won't be doing that. I'm sorry, right? Like, but again, it really depends on just how much pain it's causing. So.
Yeah, we have another question here from online. Besides, actually showing off, demos or videos in your portfolio, what kind of skills do AAA studios really look for from new developers?
Okay. So I'm going to tell you the secret one that often doesn't get talked about enough, but this will go a long way. It's professionalism. One of the things is that there is a lot of competition right now, right? There's a lot of people who have impressive portfolios, but I want you to imagine two people who have like a great portfolio, good understanding of the company they're applying to. What's going to separate them between each other? And the answer is like, well, how collaborative can they be in a team environment? How much are they coming here to learn versus coming here to think they're hot shit and going to show everyone how smart they are? A very common thing is like, if you can find somebody who's like joining your company to learn and sort of be like, how can I help? At Riot, we call it a growth mindset. Those are the things that'll actually make you stand out, because especially with, I'm going to sound like an old person here, but especially with younger people, there's a lot of like, I know what I'm doing, I'm the hot stuff, whatever, that can actually end up being very difficult to work with, even if they're actually like a genius at game design or something like that, versus somebody who might be a notch or two down in game design, but will work well with your team, create, a good environment and stuff like that. So basically, like I said, professionalism will go a long way in separating you out from others, especially if you get to the interview phase. Now, if your question is before the interview phase, the thing I will tote that is debatable is I think a cover letter that shows that you actually understand what the company you're applying for wants, that can separate out you as well. So.
Awesome, yeah. What does an average day look like for you? As much as you can tell us, of course. Is there kind of a day-to-day, like everything is kind of like this, and then occasionally something breaks and it all changes or something? What does that look like, I guess?
Yeah, so for someone in my position, the answer is every day is very, very different. But I'll try to give you an approximate, which is for me, I will usually start my day around 7 a.m. From 7 to 9, it's nice because no one else is working, so I can like read player feedback or try something out on the build that I've been curious about. Like, hey, is multi-striker doing too much damage? Let me get into the sims and test that out. It's a time for me to just kind of like think about stuff I want to talk about. Starting at 9 o'clock, I might have a meeting with like my product manager or my director or anything like that, leading into 10:30 where we do our morning play tests. So I might get to play a future set that we're working on and see how that's going. Into 12 to 4 is usually various meetings. It could be one-on-ones with my direct reports. It could be, hey, we're getting a presentation about our last player survey, or we're talking about how we're going to organize our structure of the organization. Like, hey, we're going to need this many people. It could be, I could be doing interviews with new applicants. I could be like, that's the thing that varies pretty heavily. Into around 5 to 7 p.m. where I try to get another round of like focus time of like looking at the game, looking at players. This is also why, like, if you ever follow my Twitter, why I usually tweet at like 6 to 8 in the morning my time. It's like, that's my focus time. So, but again, it varies wildly each day, just what's going on. Like, I'm here at Riot right now because most of my day today is like, I'm in a room with 3 other designers working on a future set, but having the in-face thing where I can actually talk about each design is really collaborative, and so that's why I'm here in person. But like, that'll be done next week, and then I'll move to something else, and so yeah, I kind of jump all over the place.
Cool. Yeah. We have a question here. Earlier, you spoke that like your strength is in building mechanics, but you kind of have a weaker point in thematics. Does that influence like your decision making on whether you build mechanics for themes or if you build themes from mechanics?
Yeah. Yeah, so interestingly enough, we actually already kind of have a process with that, right? Like we start every set with thematics, right? And so the nice thing is, because again, my strength is mechanics, I've hired and got a bunch of people who are better at thematics, right? So I use the name Giovanni, right? I'll have Giovanni like take a look at it and be like, yo, does this look good? We'll start with that thematics wrapper. And then it's my job to sort of go, okay, but in order for that to work, that champion's going to need to do X and X and X, and people are going to want to build the comp this way, and it's going to need this item build, but that champion's going to overlap with like, so everyone sort of has their place on the team. But just because my strength happens to be mechanics doesn't mean that's more important or first. So if anything, we've actually gone the opposite way, where thematics is first, right? Like set 12, the magic and mayhem thing, right? We first were like, we're going to kind of take a magical school approach and then figure out what champions. And then that's where it's like, okay, then what's the mechanic? Well, we've been wanting to try something like spells for a bit, so let's try this, and come up with the rules. But yeah, so TLDR, we're usually a thematics first, mechanics second.
Yeah. All right. Earlier you said, getting your foot in the door is really built on experience. Do you feel like for recent graduates, would it be okay to work on their own personal projects if they can't necessarily get in at some smaller studio or somewhere else in the industry?
I think it's an okay substitute. The trick there, so one of the reasons people value experience is because it shows, remember I was talking about the professionalism? It shows that you lasted a while in a professional environment with a team. And so the problem with doing an indie game is that doesn't necessarily show that. But if you make a really good indie game where it shows like some very clear growth, that can work. It's not a dead option, but it is going to have to show a different set of skills. If it's an indie game with let's say a team of 5, and you talk about how you worked with everybody and collaborated in a good way, that can go pretty far. But if it's a self indie game, the line between like a solo indie game and a hobby is really thin. And just saying I did this as a hobby doesn't really cut the bar. So that's the challenge there. But it's not to say it's impossible, right? Like it's going to be a little harder.
How do you work with people on, during an ideation phase without kind of bringing your own bias on ideas? Maybe you came up with one and you're like, I really like this, but somebody else comes up with another. How do you kind of work through that process without trying to kind of almost force your idea forward?
Yeah, so this is something that takes training. It honestly took me about 7 years to really train this skill. But you almost have to turn your brain off as far as who the idea came from, right? Like if you wanted to be really blunt about this, it's have everyone write down ideas on a blank card so you don't even know who they came from, shuffle them up, post them on a board and be like, which ones are the best ideas, right? And if you're a really good game designer, all you care about is making the best product, not who they came from. And so you should be trying to find the best thing. The other thing that's important here is that just because an idea, let's say someone posts an idea, right? And it's yeah, but it's got this problem. That doesn't mean that idea was directionally incorrect. It might just mean some of the mechanics are off or something's off. One of the exercises I often force myself to do, and if you've ever watched my stream, you probably hear me say this, but I'll always be like, well, I think that's a bad idea, but gun to my head, if I had to make it work, here's how I'd make it work, right? And it forces you to evaluate the idea and think through it to the end. And so oftentimes you might be surprised where you're like, my first instinct was this idea is bad. But if I stop and think about it and I'm like, okay, how would I make that work? Well, I would have to make sure that there are 5 costs and do this. No, actually, that might work just fine. Actually, that's kind of pretty cool. Okay, let's do that, right? You have to have the discipline to not just jump to your gut reaction and your own biases and really think through the logic behind the idea, separate it from the person and just really focus, is this the best thing for the game? And again, it will take training because human intuition is that hey, I thought of this, I own it. Another common thing that comes up, and you've probably heard a lot of designers say this, is do not be precious about ideas. If I say an idea right now and my boss says it's terrible, no problem, because I have a million other ideas. I don't own any ideas. Ideas are not precious. A common thing they also say in the industry is ideas are cheap. Everyone has ideas. There's plenty of them out there. I think there's more crude versions of the saying I'm not going to say here. But ideas are easy, so don't get connected to your idea. Early on in Nintendo, one of the things I had to learn is like I make a level and my boss is like, that's terrible. And my response shouldn't be like, oh, but my level I worked so hard on. My response should be, okay, time to make a different level, right? What's the goals? Let me try that again. You should never be precious with your designs because, again, the goal is make the best game possible at the end.
Yeah. This is a question, I guess, specifically about job postings. They're saying, you know, when looking for jobs, how can you apply to anything when they require 5 years of experience? Do you feel like sometimes recruiters will kind of upsell what a job requires, and should people be not necessarily ignoring the requirements that are listed, but being a little bit lenient with what maybe they've got 2 years of experience, but they have like a lot of work in game economy, and they're working on, I don't know, the economy of MMO, right?
Yeah. So, okay. So there's a couple ways I'm going to be a little snide for a second. I can hear the like pessimism in that question, right? Where it's like recruiters are out there doing evil things. And you're not wrong. There are definitely recruiters out there who are bad apples and doing bad things. But one of the things you don't want to catch yourself doing is spiraling into that, like the industry's out to get me, or it's too hard, or it's terrible. That will put you in a mindset of like, it's doomed, right? And like, and again, you're not wrong. There are definitely people out there that are like upselling their spots. That's true. But your job should just be like, hey, I'm going to keep applying to these companies. I'm going to state my case. And if they don't want me, their loss, right? Like that's on them. And it might be the kind of company, like there are a lot of bad companies out there. Let's not beat around the bush, right? There's, some random startup that's got the wrong goals and wants to hire the wrong type of people to make the wrong game. Like if they don't want you, that's their loss. Focus on finding the right company, right? Your job is to find the place that you're going to, he said, even if it's a mobile slot machine company, but like the people there are happy to learn and ready to show you how to build games and stuff like that, that might be the right company. So focus on the good. And again, even if, let's say, again, pessimistic outlook, it's 90% bad companies out there and 10% good. Yeah, that sucks, but your job is still focused on finding the good companies that can find you that chance. It'll be hard, but you got to do it. And so definitely just apply and keep that mindset of if they don't want you, they're lost. Try the next company.
All right. You talked about how you got in at Nintendo as your sort of starting point. Did you consider indie development prior to working at Nintendo? And then also, now that you've had all this experience, do you feel like indie development could have been a viable path for you, or are you ever even considering switching out, maybe?
Yeah. So, I mean, admittedly, I got pretty lucky because I was a naive 20-year-old going, I want to work at Nintendo, right? Without really a deep understanding of what that meant. Like, I didn't understand, like, the Japanese culture or, like, how Western companies interact with Japan companies, stuff like that. So I kind of got lucky in that regard for sure. What I will say is that Nintendo ended up being, like, I think one of the best opportunities because they're incredibly hard on you. And I think some people in, like, the United States would be like, the way their corporation works is pretty demeaning. Like I said, if a Japanese, executive comes in and says, do X, you say, yes, sir, not, you don't have a conversation because that's how they work. But they do really know how to make games, and their approach on how to make games really taught me a lot. A lot of my Nintendo approach to, like, thinking about how player experience first and stuff like that has benefited me a lot. So I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. As far as indie games go, what I'll say is it's definitely crossed my mind at times. But one of the things that indie games have to go through that's really hard is they also have to run their business. I have a lot of people I know who have, like, started companies, and they find that, like, 70 to 80% of their time is, like, fundraising, hiring, structural things like HR, all that stuff that they don't get to make games very often. And for me, the thing I'm really, really good at is building games. So the thing I want to do is I want to work for a company that, like, hey, Mort, you go over there and build game. We'll take care of all that other crap. And I'm like, great, I'll go do that thing I'm really good at. So, would I start my own company at this point? No, definitely not, because I don't want to do all the other BS. So.
Do you feel like it's better to master like a specific path within game dev as an artist or programmer, or even as a designer, or do you think it's better to almost be well-rounded either within all the disciplines or within a specific discipline?
Yeah, so I think the term they use is called T-shaped, but the short answer is I think it's better to be well-rounded. One of the things I really liked about working at Nintendo is, again, it was a subdivision of Nintendo, right? Like Nintendo's a big company, but the one we worked at was called Nintendo Software Technology. And it was only about 40, 45 people. And even then, at the time, there were like 2 or 3 games being worked on. So like the first Mario versus Donkey Kong game I worked on, it was 3 designers, And so when there's 3 designers, they're like, hey, we need somebody to make the menu for the level editor. And you're like, well, I'm not a UX designer, but fuck it. Let's see what I can do. Let's see what I can make with a 320 by 240 pixel screen. And you start to learn little bits of everything. The other nice thing is, like, because you're on a small team, you get to interact with like the engineers and the artists, and you might get little bits of wisdom from all the other people you're learning from. And all of that wisdom makes you really well-rounded so that when you're moving to the next game, there are situations you're now familiar with. One of the reasons companies really value experience is because it's essentially what it is it's a shortcut to all the things I've learned in the past, right? Like, hey, I know not to make a tutorial have a bunch of text because I know I've already had the experience of making a tutorial, and I know that tutorials with a lot of text are terrible. But like a fresh designer might be like, a tutorial, let's fill it with a lot of text, right? And so experience is a shortcut to that. So generally, I kind of went off on a couple tangents there, but generally, well-rounded is what you want to be. It'll help you approach all problems, and you won't get stuck as much. I think well-rounded is the way to go. All
right. If let's say the team implements a feature, and you guys are all super confident, you're like, this is going to be great, and it really worked well for the gameplay and all that. All your internal play tests were great, but then when you bring it out to players, or you go into like a small QA team, and they all hate it. What kind of processes do you guys go through for, like, do you change that? Do you just kind of throw the whole thing out? What does that look like specifically at Riot, and then maybe what your philosophy might be if it's any different?
Yeah, so there's a lot to break down there. That's a fun question, because first off, if you are confident in it and your QA was your playtests were confident, then you ship it and everyone hates it. There's a lot to evaluate there, right? Where it's like, how were you so wrong? And if you're not taking that as a learning opportunity of like, what was wrong with me and what the hell was I thinking that got us to this point, you were doing something very wrong, right? Because really in the end, all that matters is that players have fun with the thing. And if they're not, you screwed up, right? And so something about your process is very wrong. The best example I can give in TFT is shadow items. Shadow items was a thing, but what I'll tell you is I wasn't that confident when we shipped it. Shadow items shipped out of necessity because we ran out of time and needed the set mechanic. And I went, this is kind of the best I got. And my boss was like, Kiss Curse is usually really bad. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. But like, it's all I got. And maybe it'll be fine because TFT is different than League. It wasn't fine. It was terrible. Players hated it. But again, the clear thing is like, cool. The learning here is Kiss Curse is bad. The action is let's fix it quick with Radiant items. And let's make a change. And thankfully, I wasn't so bad at my job that I thought it was like a home run, But if I had thought it was a home run, I would immediately be like, okay, I need to figure out what I'm getting wrong here, because clearly I'm the issue here, right? Like, so really, if you're seeing something as good and players aren't, you've got to change how you're thinking about it and think about the problem. And that's going to be really important because, again, if you have that growth mindset, if you're really trying to improve as a designer, it's thinking about players, approaching players, and how do they like the game, not just what you understand is good.
Cool. What are your thoughts on sort of taking almost volunteer work, maybe low-paid jobs in order to get that experience in the industry? Do you think that it's valuable to kind of work in that almost like volunteer capacity, or do you think it almost is more detrimental to have that on a portfolio?
So I think there's a difference between volunteer and low pay. I think volunteer could be a company taking advantage of you, right? Like if you're literally getting nothing, I think that's rough. I think that also won't be perceived as sort of a professional environment. So that can be pretty rough. Low pay, on the other hand, I think if you have to do your first year at a little bit low pay, again, experience is experience. And if anything, you can have in the interview for your second job, you can be like, look, I took this to get experience. It was a good experience. I learned this, and now I'm ready to move on. That can be positive. For reference, when I got that internship at Nintendo, the pay was $10 an hour. Now, granted, that's 20 years ago, but $10 an hour when at McDonald's I was making $8.50. So it's not like it was a lot. So, still definitely taking that job at Nintendo. I'm not an idiot. Now, thankfully, 6 months later, they bumped me up to $20 an hour, and that felt really good to essentially double my pay. But again, like $10 an hour, I wasn't running in, I wasn't rolling in money. That was working to get that experience. So.
All right. Comparing your experiences at Nintendo and at Riot, obviously you're working at Riot now, so you probably enjoy it more. What would you say are some of your biggest differences or takeaways working at both and seeing how?
Yeah, so I'm working at Riot now because it's the job I have and it supports family, and I like things about it. But to say it's better, that's an oversell, right? Like there are pros and cons to each company, right? So you talk about the differences. Nintendo has a much better understanding of what it takes to make a new game. I believe their approach to making games is some of the best I've ever seen. I think and if you're willing to go, sir, yes, sir, you will learn a lot there. And if I could tell anyone, if you somehow magically had the choice to work at Nintendo or Riot for your first job, pick Nintendo, right? You will learn so much more there. It will be harder. You will make less money, but you will learn a lot there. Riot, though, what I'll tell you is I get to work on games I'm more interested in. It's 11 years into my career. I enjoy TFT much more than I enjoy the puzzle game that was Mario versus Donkey Kong. And so this late in my career, I know things. I get to work on some more fun stuff, and so that's a lot more exciting for me. I think the other thing is just I think the big benefit for me at Riot is the type of games I get to make are something I enjoy more. I think it's a lot more collaborative at Riot as well. It's less, here's the orders, follow them. And it's more wouldn't it be cool if we did this? There are a few things in TFT we've just shipped because it's wouldn't that be funny? Yeah, okay, let's do it. I remember set 6, Giovanni was I want to add a hat. You drop a boot, and if you pick it up, it goes on your little legend's head. And I went, okay, go ahead. Right? We can just do that. Whereas Nintendo, there'd be well, you got to ask this person, and you got to ask this person, and so. But yeah, that's kind of some of the big differences. The other thing I'll say is at Nintendo, you are dealing with Japanese culture, and so you have to learn sort of their hierarchy. Communication is harder, stuff like that. But again, learning to talk to a Japanese company, you learn how to talk in brevity, which actually really helped. Whereas Riot had a lot of very highly educated people who often say a lot of big words but don't say much. So
All right. We have a couple questions that I've kind of amalgamated here that aren't exactly how they were originally, but it's a lot about, or sort of portfolio work. Do you feel when applying for a job itself, let's say a game designer position at TFT, do you feel it's valuable to have experience, in your portfolio to have GDDs of almost auto chess-like games, or do you feel having a breadth of experience is more valuable?
So I'm just going to use here's how we look at applicants, right? Generally what we're looking for is sort of because again, everyone out there who's kind of applying has some level of experience or various things. The real talk is the difference between what student projects you worked on and things like that probably won't swing the needle too much. What will swing the needle a bunch, because it's let's say again, you have 2 candidates, they both made student projects. What's not actually we'll look at those student projects and go, yeah, that one looks pretty cool. That one looks pretty cool too. No one's getting in there and being well, in that student project, their jump button felt wrong, so that's -3 points. That's not really how it works, because there might be context behind why your jump button is wrong that we don't know, right? But what's going to separate those 2 candidates out is really an understand. That's why I go back to the cover letter, right? It's you're applying to TFT, so like talk to me about your understanding of Riot, of TFT. What do you like? Why do you want this job? What is your motivation behind it? And then in that letter, we also get some of that professionalism. That'll get you to the interview. And then if you get to the interview, that's where we talk about, again, like how well you can collaborate with people and stuff like that. But like, I think literally working on an auto battler game will be a small +1, but it's not going to like massively make your resume better than somebody else's.
All right. Would you say then that like on a portfolio, maybe instead of having like demos of your game, maybe you have a demo as well, but like almost a breakdown of your design goals or sort of your process? Would you think that is more important?
Yeah, hilariously enough, one of the things I've seen over the years with applicants, right, is like, let's say you worked on a student game, right? It's one thing to go, this is the student game I worked on. Okay, but what did you do on that student game, right? And you can always tell the difference between the person who like kind of helped a little bit on it and is kind of like glazing over their answers versus the person who like talks about the struggles they had while they were building it, where they're like, yeah, so we ended up on this, but that was because we tried this thing first and that was really rough. And then I adjusted this and I had this breakthrough at like 11 o'clock at night when I was in the shower and then we changed it. And that, like, you can tell that's the person that's like really invested in their work and like they understand the thing they're working on. And like, that's where you're like, ooh, this person might have it, right? So like, that's the big thing you're looking for. It's less about that, like, look at this game I made and tell me about your experiences in building games.
All right. It seems like most of our questions here have dried up, but I left one here for the very end, in case, if any more come up, it won't be the end, but in the event that some don't, unless there's some on the meet that I didn't see.
I put them all in.
All right, awesome. So, you've been here, you've been great help for all of us, a lot of interesting information. Some people have been asking how they can kind of reach out to you afterwards if you're interested. Would they be able to add you on LinkedIn to talk? Do you prefer Twitter messages? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so, okay, this is going to be a crappy answer, and I'm sorry. This is a hard one. So, hilariously enough, I like doing stuff like this. I like reaching out and answering questions. But unfortunately, I've reached this point where the volume is too high. So the one thing I always tell people is I promise I read everything that is sent to me, but I cannot in a realistic way keep up with everything and reply to everything. So it's really rough. So the best I can offer you is if you reach out on LinkedIn or Twitter with a long message, again, I promise I read it, but I cannot promise you, and you can't hate me, that I don't reply. That's the thing that I'm just like, I can't. It's untenable. Sometimes you get lucky, or it's like, or I read your message and I'm like, you know what? I have a really good answer for this person. I need to reply to them. I do reply to some. That's sort of how I met Dean a bit. But I can't. Like literally today, I think I've gotten 38 DMs on Twitter alone. I can't spend my day doing that. And so if you can look past that and forgive me when I don't reply to you, you're happy to reach out to me. But I'm sorry. And like I said, it sucks because I want to have these kind of like one-to-ones and help people, but I only have so much time in a day and it sucks and I hate it.
Yeah. I mean, I figure that you're pretty busy, so I'm sure you'll probably get some students reaching out. They all know now. So,
yeah, and like I said, just don't hate me when I don't reply, please. Just don't hate me.
Another question that kind of came up in my head now, do you have any sort of resources or tips that you might kind of be like, oh, this is a good place for maybe people to find mentors in the games industry, anything like that?
So this is one where I have both a bad answer and a good answer. The bad answer is, to be honest with you, I don't. It's pretty hard to find a good mentor in this industry, and it's really easy to find a lot of bad mentors. There are a lot of, game devs that like made one game and then kind of, so it's tough. It's really tough out there. But what I can tell you that's a positive here is that one of the best things for me when I was starting out, and I think will be good for you, is find people with the same goals in your age group and talk about making games and talk about, whether it be Discords or in person, if you guys have this college, that's great. Because for me, like going to DigiPen, where I'm going with a bunch of students who also wanted to make games, that was so good for me because it was like, all of a sudden, you're staying up all night talking about like, well, why did they make the game this way? And you're like breaking, like, I remember we were playing World of Warcraft when I was in college, and it's like, we're talking about why did they balance the dungeon this way? Why don't rogues do this? And it's like, well, you didn't realize that warlocks need to have this much damage, otherwise they wouldn't do this. And you're like, oh, fuck, I didn't even consider that. And, you get to like nerd out about that stuff. That was actually like the best thing for me in that like 18 to 22 range, was just being able to constantly talk about games and see other people's perspectives. And because, again, being a game designer is about understanding other players' empathy, not your own, you have to interact with other people to understand that. And so finding those people, even in your same age group, not necessarily mentors, that you can understand other people's perspective on games, that is super valuable. And like I said, my college years, that was the biggest thing. Like my classes, my teachers, it's fine. But man, interacting with the other students was like massive. And I'm not just saying that because you guys are at college. Like straight up, that's actually the truth. Like, so.
All right,
good
yeah.
for questions?
Pardon?
Are we good for questions?
I got a couple more in here actually that have popped up as you've been talking, so this is good. Through the evolution of TFT as well as your experience on other games, how has your sort of ideology or understanding of development logs kind of evolved? What have you kind of found is important? What do you feel like maybe isn't as important to include in anything that maybe is going to be either internal or going external to players or fans of the series?
So just to make sure I understand the question, you said development logs?
Yes.
Okay. So generally, internally, hilariously enough, you're going to laugh, but a lot of people were like, oh, you got to keep records and stuff. I have found the opposite, that anytime you make a written document that's like, here's my learnings and whatever, 2 years later, nobody knows where the document is and nobody reads it. So it's actually kind of surprising in the industry how much people like really obsess over their documentation that nobody then reads. Like, for example, when I was working on League of Legends, I used to be the missions guy, and I worked on missions for about 12 months. And I had this like literally 100-page slide document that talked about every mission I did, what worked, what didn't, what were the benefits, what were the learnings. And like 2 years later, nobody has looked at that document since. So it's kind of hilarious how little that helps. But externally is different. One of the things I think is really valuable externally, especially if you're making a live service game, but really just in general, is someone I used to work with, you used the term arm your advocates. It's like showing players that you as a dev understand, hey, look, we made this thing for you guys. You hated this part. We're never going to do it again. That'll make players go, great, they understand us, and we can count on them never doing this again. They're not going to ship Phantom that instantly kills a unit. That was terrible, and they agree. Awesome, I can trust this game. And it's about building player trust. And so for me, like one of the reasons I stream, one of the reasons I write learning articles and stuff like that is to show people like, look, man, I get it. We tried a thing, you didn't like it, or we tried a thing and you loved it, and here's where we're at and here's where we're going. And that builds that trust. So that then when some other player is like, man, these devs, they don't freaking get it, other players will jump in and go, no, they do. See, look, you just got to go read this thing. They do. And so building that trust, I think, is really, really important to continue, because otherwise you become the faceless corporation, right? You become the evil Riot that doesn't know how to balance a game, and they don't know any better because no one's saying anything otherwise. So I don't know. I just found that communicating your goals, being honest, has been a really valuable thing externally to build that player trust.
Awesome. Yeah. We have a question about sort of RNG mechanics. Obviously, TFT has a lot of those. How do you feel how do you balance a bunch of like random mechanics all together in order to still have skill expression as sort of a main focus, specifically in TFT, and maybe if you have thoughts on other games?
Yeah. So I actually have given a couple talks on this, but one of the things to understand is that, let's say, I always give the Mario Party example. Let's say you're making a game like Mario Party, right? And you roll a dice, and that dice rolls a 1, right? That can happen randomly. We all agree? Great. You roll the dice a second time. It rolls a 1. Still can happen, right? You roll the dice a third time. It's a 1. What is going through the player's head at this point? Is this game broken? This is bullshit. I hate this game. Why am I playing this? This is dumb, right? All I did was roll a dice 3 times, and I've already got a player thinking that my game is broken and doesn't work, right? And so if you're making a game with random mechanics in it, you have to have an understanding of how players perceive random. And let me be very clear on this. Players suck at perceiving random. Absolutely are human beings. You know the stupid thing where you see the roulette wheel in a casino and it shows the numbers? And there are people that's like, look, there's 13 red. It's definitely going to be black next time. That's not how random works. So as a designer, you have to design you're not designing a random experience. You're designing an experience for them to enjoy. So going back to the Mario Party example, I can tell you that the way Mario Party is programmed is that there's actually a table of dice rolls that never has the same number more than twice in a row that they pull from, because they don't want the player to have that experience of rolling the same number 3 times in a row, right? Like they think about those outcomes that they want a player to have. Something I've talked about briefly, and I'll never say how it works because players will dig into it, but like in TFT, we have a rule hidden in the game that says if you haven't seen a unit in X rolls, bring it up, because we don't want you to have the experience where you literally roll 100 gold and don't see the thing you're looking for, because that's an experience you have to design around. And so basically this is all to say, if you're going to use randomness in your game, you have to control that randomness to have a good player experience. Otherwise, you're just leaning into randomness and chaos, and there are really bad experiences in that chaos. And then when doing that, so to your question of like, well, how do you make sure there's skill expression? The skill expression is the decisionness within the random factors, right? Like Mario Party, there's not much skill. You roll the dice, you move forward, right? But in poker, there's a lot of skill. If I hand you 2 cards, what you do with those cards can vary wildly based on your skill. And so in TFT, it's like, we're going to deal you a hand of essentially augments, champions, shops, items, whatever. The skill is how you use them. So it's about balancing those 2 things within each other.
All right.
That's a very fast version of that talk. I can give that talk in more detail, but like that's a very fast version of that.
All right. Well, I think that's all our questions. So thank you so much. I'm sure Dean's got a bit of a closing remark here for you, but
yeah,
on our side, it's been great having you.
it has been wonderful having you. But one last thing. So as you may or may not remember, I've spoken about how we have our event at the end of the year with, our whole, everyone makes a game, we get to show it off at a convention. So advice for everyone to take home, taking back to design specifically, in the terms of innovation in working in such a small scope, let's say 4 months, if you wanted everyone here to take home something to remember, innovation-wise, what would you have us know?
Yeah, the thing to understand about if you're especially if you have a game with 4 months, right? Think about the core thing, the one thing in your game that you think is going to make people remember that game, and build around that. And that's the thing, so don't worry about the story or the graphics or anything like that. What is the hook? Think about the hook that's just going to make that game stand out more. And that's where true innovations in the game industry comes from. It's about what's that small thing that's different than any other game. If you think about that thing, everything else around it is easy, right? So as a dumb example, let's say your hook is a character that has 5 jumps. Great. Then you can make levels, add a score system, add a map screen, whatever. That's all easy. That's just legwork. But thinking of that tiny little spark that's the core, focus on that. That will be your innovative thing, and that's the thing that you'll want players to remember. You'll end up with a good game if you do that.
Wonderful advice. Well, as we're approaching 8 o'clock, or 4 o'clock for you, I'd like to personally, as well as everyone else here, thank you so much for having you on here. Your advice has been very valuable.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. And again, I know I'm just kind of yapping, so hopefully this was valuable and useful, and hopefully a lot of you end up in the industry and have a great time. So like I said, I'm just an old guy yapping, so apologies for that, but
An old guy yapping is pretty priceless to me.
It's been pretty insightful, so thank you so much. Can we get a round of applause?
All right. Thank you. Take care. Have a good day.
Congratulations on your promotion.
Oh, thank you. All right. Take it easy.
Take care. Bye-bye.